Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I'm going to show you an opening which is called the French defense. So it starts with e4, e6, d4 and then d5. So before we go to the next move, I will show you another move which is available for white. It is g3, knight to f3, queen to e2, and the last one is d3. So for the g3, knight to f3, d3, I think just play d5 immediately. But for queen to e2, I think the best reply for black is to play e5. And after d5, it can transpose to Lopez after knight to f3 and then knight to c6. Okay, let's start our discussion. So after e6, well, I know it is a defensive move, but it is also preparing black to play d5, which is challenging white center. So d4 and then d5. Like I said before, it is quite different with the Scandinavian. After e4, d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight to c3. Instead, in this variation, if white takes the d5 pawn, black can take it with the pawn instead with the queen. So it is quite different. And also by playing d5, black is questioning white whether he wants to advance his pawn to the e5 or takes the d5 pawn, or even protected the pawn by playing knight to c3, knight to d2, and then bishop to d3. So after d5, let's start our discussion with the e5, which is called the advanced variation, keeping an eye on the d6 and the f6 square. So let's say after f5, white can take it. So after e5 move, I suggest you to play c5 immediately, challenging the white center pawn at the d4. So let's say after he takes the c5 pawn, knight to c6 is a better move rather than bishop to c6, bishop takes c6, because after this then queen to g4 is coming. But that's not a big threat. Okay, knight to c6 is better, developing the pieces and also attacking the e5 pawn. So after c5, white play c3 and then queen to b6, reinforce the c5 pawn, helping him to attack the d4 pawn. It is a big difference after knight to c6, because then white can protect the d4 pawn by playing bishop to e3, and after queen to b6, which is attacking the b3, white can protect it by playing queen to d2. So after queen to b6, this bishop cannot go to the e3, because then this pawn will be hanging. So the continuations is knight to f3, and then knight to c6. So it is typical game of the French defense, challenging the white center by playing king to b6, knight to c6, and then after that maybe knight g to e7 to the f5 or to the g6. But for you have a little problem with this bishop because it is too passive and there's no way to attack the king. I mean the white king. After knight to c6, bishop come to d3, and there's another variations, bishop to e2, and then a3. But I think for bishop to e2, it is too passive because this bishop doesn't attack anything. But after bishop to d3, suddenly these pieces can attack the black king side at h7. Okay, c takes d4, c takes d4, and then bishop to d7. Well, note that you can take the d4 pawn by knight, because after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and then bishop to b7, winning a pieces. So bishop d7 is a good move, developing a pieces and also preparing to take the d4 pawn. Okay, castle is a good move instead of bishop to c2, because after bishop to c2, I think you should play knight to b4 immediately to take this active bishop, and after that you can activate your white bishop. Okay, another moves like castle and then takes rook to c8, knight to c3, and knight to e7, maneuvering to the c6, sorry, or even f5. Okay, go back to the main line. After castle, white gives black a pawn already. After it takes at the d4, takes, and then knight to c3. So if he takes the e5 pawn, white can play rook to e1, and after queen to b8, white can take the d5 pawn, pinning this pawn by rook. Okay, so black must play carefully by playing a6, protecting this b5 square. Maybe this knight will come to this, or even the bishops. So after a6, white must do something with the e5 pawn, or it will be taken. So queen to e2, clearing the file for the both rooks at the f1 and the a1, connecting it, and also preparing maybe h1, queen to h1, f4, etc. So after queen to e2, knight to e7, typical French defense, activating, maneuvering this knight to maybe c6, c6 or g6. Rook to d1. Maybe you want to play queen to b6 for a safe move, or even knight to c6. So for the knight to c6, the continuation is bishop takes a6, queen takes e5, bishop takes b7, queen takes e2, knight takes e2, and then rook to b8, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, and then knight to d4. So white has a compensation, black 2. White must face this must face a pair bishop, and black must face 2 passed pawn at the B file and the A file. So I think it's still unclear position, and then bishop to d7 is the move. So let's go to the other variations. It is queen to b6 and after bishop to e3, maybe queen to b4 is a good move. Note that if you play d4, white can check the d4 pawn by playing bishop takes d4, and if you take the d4 bishop, white suddenly has a massive attack by playing bishop to b5. So I'm going to give you an example for our discussions, and this is the game between Pete Lagano 2033 and Wegener 2199, which is held in Slovenia 2002. So it starts with e4, e6, and then let's go to the variations. And then after rook to d1, Wegener decided to play knight to c6. Takes, okay, and then here comes a3. Well, actually, after looking at this game, I think white should try a4 to advance his passive pawn as soon as possible to this promoted square. And the game and continue with f6. Note that if you play e5 immediately, then knight to f3, attacking this 2 pawn, and then after f6, white take the d5 pawn with the rook, and then winning a pawn. Okay, so white didn't play a4, instead he played a3. Okay, a3, and then bishop to d6, developing a pieces, b4, and then f6. Well, it is a good move. The first point to play f6 is to reinforce the e6 pawn to the e5. Let's say if he play g3 and then e5, knight to b3, and suddenly black has a good pawn center. Okay, so after f6, the second is preparing black king to jump to the f7. and connecting these both rooks. And the third is preparing the rook come to the c8. Okay, the game will continue by playing f4. Well, I think it's too soon for white. Maybe white should try knight to b3. If black play bishop a4, then rook to d3, king f7, bishop e3 reinforce the c5 square, and if rook h to c8, then knight to c5, which is still unclear for both sides. Okay, f4, and then king to f7, connecting the both rooks, and maybe the rook will come to the c8. Okay, rook to a2. Well, I think maybe white should try g3 first, and after rook h to c8, bishop to b2, rook to c4, rook a to c1, rook b to c8, takes, and then maybe knight to b3, or king to f2. Okay, so after rook to a2, black decided to take the c file by playing rook h to c8, rook to e2, after rook to c4, and then bishop to b2. I think this is a blunder from white. Maybe g3 first is a good one. If he play rook b to c8, then bishop to b2 is playable. Okay, after bishop to b2, black take the f4 pawn, because winning a pieces. After rook to f1, black retreat the bishop to d6. So if you look this diagram, you see that this pawn is better than this, because this pawn will be promoted easily rather than this pawn. Okay, so knight to f3, king to g8, another good move from black, avoiding check from maybe king knight to g5, sorry. So king to g8, and then rook to d1. Well, actually at this diagram, I think white is already loose. And then after rook b to c8, knight to e1, it's too passive, and black has a good pressure at the queenside. King back to the f7, g3, and then h5, preparing the attack at the king side, and also keeping an eye at the g4 square. Okay, knight to f3, bishop to c7, preparing b6, and then reinforce this pawn to d4. Okay, king to the g2, bishop b6, rook to d2, and then bishop b5. Well, after knight to e1, now black has an easy win after e5. Note that you can take this pawn, because then bishop to c6, pinning the rook and also the king. So after rook to c2, well, black is winning. King to e6, and the game will end in a couple of moves. Bishop to c1, d4, king to f1, king to d5, knight to e1, and then e4. And white resign because there's no way to stop this two pawn. And after king to g1, king to g2, maybe bishop to e2. So a good example for our discussion. I hope you enjoy this. Maybe if you want to give another example, just email me at the description. And good luck with your friends at funds. Bye bye.